Welcome, friends. We're going to give it a few minutes so everybody can log in, and then we will begin. Welcome, welcome, everybody. We're going to give it another minute, and then we will begin. Welcome, friends. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are going to begin in about 30 seconds. Welcome, everyone. My name is David Gruber, and I am the Senior Development and Communications Director here at MDHA. I am really, really honored to be here today to both open and close today's hard conversation. Tomorrow night, observant Jews the world over will mark the 1951st anniversary of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, as the Romans crushed one of the only revolts during the Pax Romana. And Jews asked themselves, what had they done wrong to have the focal point of their religion burned to the ground? Had they not been scrupulous enough in observing the Torah? Had they not been faithful enough in practicing their rituals? The ancient rabbis told them that that was not the issue. The issue was not that they had not treated God right. The issue was that they had not treated each other right. They had not sufficiently cared for each other. They had not heeded the words of the Hebrew prophets, who hundreds of years before had emphasized that the God of the Hebrew Bible cares very little for ritual. This God cares for how you treat the poor, the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. And so today it's very fitting that we will hear about how the local faith community is heeding God's message to my ancestors 1,951 years ago. So please listen carefully and heed the messages you hear today and actively reflect on what you can do in your own community. And I'll be back at the end for a final reflection and a very important announcement. It's now my privilege to introduce our good friend Ian Mattingly, who will say a few words on behalf of our sponsor, the Apartment Association of Greater Dallas, and introduce our moderator and one of the people I most look up to, my boss, Nissy New.
Thank you, David. What a moving and an incredible introduction. Certainly not one that I am eager to follow. So I'll simply say that the Apartment Association of Greater Dallas is so thrilled to sponsor this hard conversation with an illustrious panel of faith leaders. As you know, members of the Apartment Association have long partnered with the faith community in our shared mission of preventing and working to end homelessness. And we're eager to hear about the innovative approaches that these leaders have developed. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Nissy New. Nissy is the Chief Operating Officer for the Metro Dallas Homeless Alliance, a post she's held for about a year now, after leaving the directorship of the Child Poverty Action Lab. And Nissy, I will turn it over to you because I'm eager to hear what these faith leaders have to say.
Thank you so much, Ian, for that. And thank you, David, for giving us that wonderful little sermon in the beginning. So this is kind of one of our fourth installment of the Hard Conversation series. We're really excited about this. And the Hard Conversation series is really talking about what kind of community do we want to build. And for a lot of us, the faith community is so tied into what we do and who we worship with and who we build community with. And so how do we connect that to homelessness? How do we connect that to the world that we're serving today? So I'm really, really excited to have a diverse audience and talk about some really good things, such as personal journey, but also talking about racial equity in this, and then talking about NIMBYism and really helping us all think about what kind of community do we want to build. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists and kind of kick off the first round of conversations. We really want this to be an engaging conversation. So we want you to ask questions. So put questions in the Q&A box. David will come in here and there and kind of add additional questions. So this is really also engaging. This is for everyone to be a participant and join us. So our first panelist is former City of Dallas Mayor Laura Miller and Rabbi Adam Roffman from Congregation Shearith Israel. They will discuss the Ladder Project, which is an incredible project that focuses on lifting one person at a time out of homelessness. We'll also be joined by Almas Muscatwalla of Faith Forward Dallas. She's the executive director. And we'll talk to her a lot about housing and homelessness efforts and how she really builds a diverse coalition of faith leaders and how she gets them all to align with the great vision of Faith Forward Dallas. Then we have Larry James, which if you have been in the nonprofit community and if you've been in the business community, you've been in Dallas, you know who he is. He's the CEO Emeritus of CitySquare and senior pastor at Highland Park United Methodist Church. So excited to have him. Last, but certainly not least, is Pastor Chris Simmons, who is with Cornerstone Baptist Church. And we're going to learn a lot about how he built a community around his church, how that happened and the work that he's done there. So now that I've done a quick intro for all of those, I want to kick it off to Pastor Chris. And Pastor Chris, tell us, what is your journey personally with connecting your faith to homelessness?
Yeah, just kind of give you a background. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and my biological parents were foster parents. And so learned at an early age the importance of giving back. In fact, thought because of my parents' commitment, thought it was second nature to care for those who could not care for themselves and helping individuals who were in a crisis. And so when I was called here at Cornerstone in the area of South Dallas, it was by that time when I arrived in 1988 to do a summer internship, which has turned into 33 summers of internships, realized we were in a community that was in despair. We had a lot of drug activity, a lot of prostitution, a lot of gang activity, and a lot of homelessness. And one of the things that we did was we went to our congregation back in the early 90s and asked the question, Since everyone is leaving the neighborhood, churches are leaving, businesses are leaving. We have hemorrhaged a lot of people related as proven by the census since the early 80s, since everybody is leaving. If we were to leave this community as a church, would the community miss us? And if not, then maybe we should go. But let's be here to have the greatest impact on the lives of the residents here, and asking the question, how do we be about letting the community know that we care? Because unless they know that we care, they could care less what we know. And so really engaging that homeless community, which was a large part of those individuals who were around the church, and figuring out how we can minister and reach out to them and being caring and considering their particular needs. And so developed a number of ministries around demonstrating care and compassion and benevolence for those individuals. And so we provide a kitchen where we serve about 13,000 meals a month. We provide a place where they can come in and get a change of clothes, a hot shower, haircuts at our clothing closet. We do about 1,000 individuals a month through that particular initiative. We have a small medical clinic. We realized that many homeless individuals would oftentimes wait until what was a cold to become a pneumonia, and then they were off to the ER at Parkin Hospital. And so we put in a medical clinic, a dental clinic, because we realized a lot of them had many dental issues and in pain because of that. And then job searching and really connecting with other resources in the community to ask ourselves, how could we love homeless people well? And realizing also that a lot of those homeless people did not come from other planets. They were the children of many of our congregants, the brothers and sisters of many of our congregants. And so how could we love not only the homeless well, but even extended family members of those within our congregation who were houseless?
That's beautiful. Thank you, Pastor Chris. Larry, can you tell us a little bit about your journey? Like, what has your personal journey been with connecting faith and homelessness?
Sure. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thanks to MDHA for putting this together. I grew up in Dallas. My parents were sharecroppers trying to eke out a living 50 miles north of Abilene, and they weren't doing too well, especially after World War II. And so they came back to Dallas, where family resided. And I was born in 50 in Spokane, Washington. That's another story, but got here by 53. And we moved to Richardson, where my dad went to work as the second employee of the city of Richardson and helped write the charter of the city. It was him and the guy who was in charge of water for the city on the staff of the city. And that was an interesting thing. My dad was very formative for me. My grandfather, who lived in Oak Cliff with my grandmother, had a job when he was much older, night watching buildings that were being constructed in downtown Dallas in the 50s. And we would typically drive to Oak Cliff each evening and pick my granddad up and bring him back to downtown where he served as a night watcher, and then we'd go home to Richardson. One night was a blustery, cold, rainy night as we were coming through downtown Dallas on our way back to Highway 75 to go north, and a man fell in front of our car. He was homeless, inebriated, and my dad was able to stop without hitting him. But I never will forget, my dad got out of the car in the rain and helped that gentleman to a place where he could be sheltered, at least under the eave of a building, and so he wouldn't drown in the street gutter, literally. More powerful than his action, though, was what he did on the way home with me and my mom. And that was simply not to say a word. It was just, he had done what he knew he needed to do. And it made an incredible impact on me. Fast forward, my first church during college was in the middle, literally in the middle of a soybean patch in central Arkansas. And it was populated by incredibly poor Arkansas farmers. And that was quite a journey. My wife and I then moved to Memphis for more seminary education, where we worked with the downtown church 3.5 years after Dr. King's murder. And that was quite a time to be in Memphis. We moved to Shreveport for what I call the 2-year and 45-minute assignment to one of the most racist cities, most racist congregations I'd ever seen. And the 45 minutes is really not pretty, so I won't go into that story, but I'd be glad to talk to you offline sometime. We moved from Shreveport to New Orleans, where our church was downtown. And we were there 5 years while I finished seminary and did PhD work at Tulane. And we actually had two congregations there. One was a transplant church from Tennessee and Texas, people coming in to work in the Gulf oil patch or to work in banking or shipping or whatever. And then that was the Sunday church. The Monday through Saturday church was the other church. I referred to it as the real church because it was populated with homeless people and vagrants and prostitutes and pimps and drug addicts and very, very poor people who were trying to survive in New Orleans, which is a marvelous place to live, but it had all kinds of really challenging situations. And then, ironically, we were called back to Richardson, where I was the pastor, the senior pastor at the church where I'd grown up there. And I served there for 14 years before coming to what was at the time Central Dallas Food Pantry. I will make one slight correction. I'm not the senior pastor at Highland Park United Methodist. I'm a senior citizen, and I'm on their pastoral staff, but I'm not the senior pastor. That goes to Paul Rasmussen, who's one of the best in the city. I'm telling you all that to say that in each one of these settings, I found that I could not escape the pain of the poor. And while I did not become a convert to Judaism, the language of the prophets and those who followed resonates deeply in my heart. But David, you summarized the entire endeavor from a faith perspective well with your introduction, because it really is true. The God I serve, the Christ I follow, is not too concerned about our worship services, if he's concerned at all, but rather about how we engage those who've been ground up in the injustice of a system that wants to ignore those that are the weakest and the poorest. So it's no surprise that 27 years ago, I had the opportunity to come downtown and begin to work in the city. And I was glad to have that opportunity, and I'm glad to have been here as long as I've been here.
Well, we're very glad that you're here as well, Larry. Thank you for that. I think it's interesting, you know, all the work that you're saying, you and Pastor Chris have talked about, it's given me goosebumps, right? It gives you that connection to why we do the work that we do in a really, really different way. Almas, what about you? What's your personal journey to homelessness?
Thank you, Nissy, and thank you, MDHA and David, for inviting Faith Forward Dallas to this very important conversation. So I have three lenses in which I want to share my personal journey. First and foremost, I grew up in Mumbai, India. Interestingly enough, if you look at the stats, it's the third largest, most homeless city in the world. I know California comes number 2 and Mumbai comes number 3. So growing up in India, pretty much I saw unhoused homeless people right around, I used to see them day in and day out. But the interesting part is that when I was migrating to USA, I had this illusion and probably an idealistic perspective about America, considering India is a developing country and America is a developed country. I had this illusion that, I'm not going to see, beggars on the street, or I'm not going to see anybody begging on street, or I'm not going to see anyone sleeping on the streets. Obviously had visited, USA on vacations, but, the lens, when you come as a tourist is very different. But coming to live here was a whole different experience. My entire illusion about, that idealism about America kind of broke when I got engaged in the issue of homelessness and unhoused people through my work with Faith Forward Dallas. So interestingly enough, so that's kind of one perspective, from the country that I come from. And my work with Faith Forward Dallas, as some of us may know, that Faith Forward Dallas came into existence on the basis, the impetus for Faith Forward Dallas has been the crisis that happened in 2015 when, Prophet Muhammad's cartoon competition happened. We lost a couple of lives then. And so that was one crisis. And then 7/7 shooting kind of consolidated Faith Forward Dallas in the mandate that we wanted to take as the faith community to respond to some of the crises. So our birth, Faith Forward Dallas birth was, on crisis. But for the past 3 years, I would say that we're taking like a more proactive approach, and we have narrowed down our kind of work to 4 areas in which we would like to work. One of them being housing solutions. We are not calling homelessness, we're calling it housing solution. We're very strategic and intentional about that. Then the other 3 areas is migrant status, gun sense, and then also racial equity. So that's kind of, so my work with Faith Forward Dallas is my another journey to understanding the issue of homelessness right here in Dallas, which is very different than what I had experienced in India. Now, my third perspective comes from my faith. I'm a Shia Ismaili Muslim, and guided by His Highness the Aga Khan, who has established the second largest non-government organization called the Aga Khan Development Network. And interestingly enough, that entire development network works on the ethical framework, of Islam. And these are ethics, even if you're not affiliated to a particular faith tradition, these ethics are relevant because as human beings, you can relate to these ethics. And some of these ethics are ethic of inclusion, ethic of compassion, ethic of generosity, ethic of governance. If you have the responsibility to govern someone, you got to have ethical premise on which you're governing people. When you're responsible for somebody's life, there's this ethic of governance. And then the last ethic that I would like to highlight is the ethic of self-reliance. So, so growing up, I have witnessed the work of the Aga Khan Development Network when every time any projects that the Aga Khan Development Network undertook, it used to kind of ensure that these ethics were incorporated. So why the ethic of self-reliance becomes important. And, I grew up, internalizing these values. Of course, they're very hard to kind of translate them into your daily life, but, they're in your subconscious, they're in my conscious level, but they are the driving factors, pretty much. So I've seen so many projects, like one of the projects, where His Highness has established, the housing projects, in the suburbs of Mumbai. And each of these projects, this idea that, you can give a fish, to a man and, you feed that person for a day. But if you teach them how to fish, then, you fed them for life, the Italian proverb. And that becomes very relevant, to the Aga Khan Development Network that I grew up as a Shia Ismaili Muslim, witnessing day in and day out that how these ethics become important. So, whenever I'm given an opportunity to address these issues of homelessness or gun sense or any of the issues that Faith Forward Dallas deals with, I'm always consciously looking that how are these projects, sustainable? Are they transformative? Are we making our communities dependent on us, or are we making them self-reliant? And these are the lenses in which kind of I assess, some of the work. So that's kind of like my little faith journey. And there's a lot more that I could talk, but I'm going to stop there. But there's interesting, lens. And, one last thing I'll say, and then I'll let kind of Nissy, you have the next person introduce that, the subject of today's conversation is about moving from charity to justice. But I think it may be another lens for us to consider as to moving from charity to development. Because when you talk about development, you're talking about more sustainable intervention in people's lives.
Perfect. Thank you for those last words. Laura, what about you? You and Rabbi Adam, I'd love for y'all to talk a little bit about your personal journeys, but then also kind of kick it off and talk about the Ladder Project. You're on mute.
Yeah. Sorry. Rabbi, why don't you give a little bit of the faith overview, and I'll get into the nuts and bolts of our pilot program.
Sure. So thank you, everybody, for having us, and it's wonderful to be with you all this morning. Just to answer the question very briefly, I'm from Baltimore, and I remember growing up going to the baseball game at Oriole Park at Camden Yards in downtown Baltimore, or even before that, Memorial Stadium on 33rd Street. And you would drive from suburban Baltimore, where I lived, through all sorts of different neighborhoods And you would see people of all different socioeconomic backgrounds, and kind of the diverse economic, racial complexity of the city was laid out before you. I moved to Dallas 8 years ago, and I live in far North Dallas now, and before that, North Dallas, and realized that on most days you could drive from Frisco to downtown Dallas and see not too many faces that didn't look like mine, and became keenly aware of the vast gap between the area that I live and work in, between 75 and the North Dallas Tollway, and the rest of Dallas, and became very concerned about the distance between myself and our larger Dallas community, and therefore the distance between our community, our Shearith Israel community, and the larger Dallas community. And together with our social action committee, began thinking about ways in which we could close that gap. And that's one of the ways that we have managed to do that is through the Ladder Project. So we've talked a little bit about the Bible. Of course, the Bible was written originally in Hebrew. And I remember the first time that I learned that this word that I had been taught when I was a little boy, tzedakah, which is the action of taking most people associate in the Jewish community of taking a coin or a dollar bill and dropping it in a little container, which is then distributed to those in need. That the word tzedakah does not in fact mean charity. It's very important for this discussion, but rather tzedakah comes from the Hebrew word for justice, which is based on the idea that if there are those that are in need, that's not people who deserve our pity or even our empathy, but rather that's an injustice created by society that needs to be corrected. And that ties in very nicely with this beautiful teaching from Maimonides, who is a 12th century Jewish philosopher and expert on Jewish law, who created a hierarchy, a ladder, if you will, of 8 different ways of mending that injustice. The bottom of that ladder is basically to throw your money to the poor. And you sort of imagine kings walking down the center street in any town and throwing the coins at the poor as if they weren't even human beings. The very top of that ladder refers back to what Almas was talking about before, about the idea of teaching a man to fish, which we trace back to this philosopher, Maimonides, who said that the highest level of giving tzedakah, of doing justice in this way, is to give a person the means to provide for themselves by either teaching them a profession or by giving them a job. So a number of years ago, Laura, who has done amazing work in the Dallas Jewish community in many ways over the last number of decades, came to us with this idea of addressing the homeless issue in Dallas in a very unique and amazing way, which is to have our community, which is has the means to support a project like this, not try and solve the entire problem, but rather to think of this in a completely different way, which is, what would it be like if every faith community in Dallas took it upon themselves to change the life of one person? And that's how this project started. I'm going to turn it over to Laura, who's going to talk about the process by which we got this project, which we call the Ladder Project, based on those 8 steps of Maimonides off the ground. And we identified our first recipient of the project and the brief history of the incredible work that Laura and her committee have done over the last couple of years.
Thank you, Rabbi. I worked for 10 years on the city council on the issue of homelessness. And my city council, when I was mayor, we focused a lot on it. The Bush administration had asked us to work on a 10-year plan to end chronic homelessness, which we embraced. And then we started the bridge. We actually held a totally separate bond program just to fund the bridge. And Mike Rawlings was the homeless czar that I asked to actually make sure that the bridge got built correctly after Tom Dunning had done the entire NIMBY fight to go citywide to find the appropriate location for it. And when I left office, I kept looking at the numbers every year and seeing that no matter how the iconic leaders of our city, Larry James, Pastor Chris, Faith Forward, everyone was working so hard on the issue. And our numbers were so intransigent, and 4,000 people were on the streets any given year, but yet there were 3,000 mosques and churches and synagogues that were in the area where these homeless people were. And I thought, is there some way to invert the entire service arrangement? Can 1,000 people in my synagogue take one person off the street and become the safety net and become the advocate for someone and give them a fresh start to then be independent financially and emotionally? And that was our pilot program. And I went to Rabbi Roffman, who had tears in his eyes when I discussed it, and told me the story of Maimonides and how much this meant to the Jewish community if we could do this. And what's ironic about it, we've done this for 3 years now. And I think there are 8 of us that are on the executive committee of this project who live and breathe and sleep and worry about this project every day. And our rabbis are incredibly supportive. But we've done this for such a long time, and we had hoped that we would bring this to Faith Forward formally as a project that could be spread around the community. But we're still a little bit of a work in progress. We took someone from the bridge 3 years ago. That person is still on their own in the same apartment we put them in 3 years ago. There have been ups and downs. I can't tell you that tomorrow they'll still be in that apartment and won't be back on the street. We've had a lot of milestones and heartache, and it's been a real road. We also have helped 3 single moms and their children to start fresh, to get them an apartment, help find them jobs. We've got, dentists and doctors and psychiatrists from our community that have volunteered to help people. We've given new dentures to people that completely changed their lives and made them look completely different and gave them self-confidence. And ironically, we've only spent $7,800 on the first gentleman that we have helped, but it's not about the money. It's about what happens emotionally to that person that you're helping on their journey after you give them a fresh start. And that's where it's complicated. And that's where Pastor Chris and Larry and, they understand that. And we struggle with that because we can be an advocate and we can help and we can pay off debt and do things for people. But at the end of the day, we require that people work and that they have a path forward. And it isn't a clean process. So it's been a journey.
Thank you, Laura. Larry, I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on it. Almas brought it up, and so did Rabbi Adam, and Laura's talking about it as well. This idea of the self-reliant person, right? The person that receives assistance becoming eventually self-reliant. You've worked in the nonprofit sector for a long time. You've had lots of neighbors that you have helped. Like, how do you juggle self-reliance with what you know?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I really appreciate all that the Rabbi and Laura have shared with us. It's inspirational. We are unapologetically a housing first organization. And we believe that a huge part of the solution is going to be permanent supportive housing for people, which includes the wraparound services that Laura has described so well. Now, whether those come from nonprofit professionals or from volunteers like in a congregation or some hybrid mixture, there's probably more power in working together than we've realized by working apart. And it hasn't been that we intended to work apart. It's just that we've all been so busy, there's not a moment to spare. And so we've not connected like we should. That's a totally other conversation. We have over 725 apartments of one kind or another that we control. And to live in one of those apartments, you have to be chronically homeless and disabled. And so we focused our attention on hard cases. But we've had some success, statistically, which is, in my view, often an offensive way to look at people, but it's still true that our retention rate after 6 months and a year is almost 90%. Now, the basis of our work is human freedom. We believe that if we can place someone in a place to live that's off the streets and then begin to barrage them with loving acceptance and invitations to engage in various activities, a portfolio of supportive activities with the person who needs those activities or the person who needs the housing unit in charge of his own or her own destiny, we have the best results. If you're an alcoholic, I don't know how in the world you ever get rid of that problem if you're on the street. I used to ask people all the time, how many alcoholics are, what percentage of the population of alcoholics are housed? And it's an astronomical number because most alcoholics are not homeless. They have a drinking problem. And so if we offer people what we think they might want to do, and we also engage them very carefully in helping us answer that question, and then we try to provide the opportunity and the choice. It's maddening at times. It's frustrating, and all the things that Laura described so well are true in every one of our properties. Most of our apartments are owned by other people, which is a good thing. We've built some of our own that is also a good thing. But when you add property management on top of everything else you're trying to do, sometimes makes you kind of pull your hair out. But I resonate so clearly with what the Rabbi and Laura say, and with what Pastor Chris says, and we need to work more closely together with each other. And you know, we challenge people to step up and take advantage of opportunities that they have. And I've got lots of anecdotal stories I could tell, but I won't right here.
Thank you, Larry. Pastor Chris, I'd love to get your thoughts on the work that you've done in terms of how do you think something like this changes the congregate at the same time that you're changing the client or you're working with that client? Like how does the volunteer's perspective change, or does it?
Yeah, so what we do is, as I mentioned, we are an inner city church, and by design, we wanted our church reflective of the community where we serve. And we serve in a neighborhood in South Dallas where the average household income is less than $16,000 a year. And so many of our congregants are really at the verge of becoming homeless themselves. But we're able to do the work that we do because of partnership with other congregations across the DFW area. And what we oftentimes hear is that the opportunity to be able to come and serve in the southern sector where there's great need is a win-win situation. It changes those congregations in the north perspective of homelessness. It gives them more capacity, a compassion towards homeless situation, realizing that everyone is not homeless because they want to be, or they have a drug problem or alcohol problem. Some of them have just had situations happened in life. The pandemic has really exposed that many individuals kind of are on living by a thread, and the smallest interruption in life can cause them to go from having a house to being homeless. And I think, to answer your question, I think it's been a win-win situation as individuals come down with the right heart and concern and compassion to help those in need. They walk away more enriched by having the experience to rub shoulders and really to come into contact with those who are having difficult times.
Thank you, Pastor Chris. Laura, I'd love to get kind of your thoughts on it. You are a congregation of 1,000 members, and you have a strong group of 8 people that have worked with you to make the Ladder Project successful. How has congregants who have touched into the project really changed, and how has the client changed because of the work that the congregation has done as well?
Well, first I want to say that I think congregations that are listening, that are interested in doing something like this, I really, really encourage it, because it sounds daunting. It's actually, there was nothing more exciting than when we took our participant from the bridge and a congregant's apartment was made available. We paid market rates, but there was no security deposit. You wipe away all of the obstacles. People who are homeless, they have bills from past evictions, which prevent them from getting new apartments. They have no credit and no cash to even get an electricity account. I mean, they have past debts. There was a single mom whose child had a saxophone, and she was still paying 3 years later an enormous, like $60 a month bill for the instrument and a maintenance contract on it. We wiped that away. I mean, there's so many things. The congregation can literally remove so many obstacles for somebody and start them in a fresh life. And I remember we set up wedding registries because they don't have like welcome to your house registries. So Bed Bath & Beyond, we have all these wedding registries that we've created, but we will literally get someone in an apartment, put out the notice to 1,000 congregants, we need furniture. The 8 of us go out and pick it up. We deliver it to the apartment. We set up a wedding wedding registry. There is no one in America who doesn't want to sit in their pajamas at midnight and buy a coffee pot that is going to go for someone who just left the bridge. I mean, it's instant that everything that somebody needs is done immediately. And a congregation can do that with little effort. It's magical for somebody. Again, it's the long-term commitment to that person that's really important. I remember when we took our gentleman from the bridge, the director of the bridge said to me, Laura, the most challenging thing is the isolation that they feel after they leave. They're leaving their community, the bridge. They're on their own, they're in an apartment. And one of the challenges that we've had with our gentleman is that he does self-isolate, and he talks about it with us. And we got him a psychiatrist pro bono, but he won't go to the psychiatrist pro bono, although it's close to his apartment. So, at the end of the day, though, realistically, it's like any organization. The pastor can tell you, Larry can tell you, there's always going to be a very small nucleus of people in your congregation that's going to do all the heavy lifting, that will answer the phone at 2 a.m. when there's a crisis, I stood in line at the DMV in Carrollton for 6 hours in July in the sun because this gentleman needed to get his new driver's license and didn't know how to go about doing it. I mean, the work is there, but it is very, very extremely fulfilling. And this gentleman said to me, when he came to some of our services, we got him a suit, he came to our services. One of the children for one of her celebrations had created artwork for him, and it was discussed at a service, and he came. And he said just last week to me, one of the most profound experiences of my life is that you all accepted me and let me sit with you and celebrate with you, and I will always remember it.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Laura. Almas, I'd love to kind of kick that off with you. So much of what we do as the homeless rehousing system and as MDHA and as all the providers who are on this call is fight against NIMBYism every single day. NIMBYism, of course, stands for Not in My Backyard. As we are embarking on an initiative to house 2,600 people, it becomes an even more topic of discussion. How do we put homeless people who have been formerly homeless into neighborhoods? What do you think is the biggest barrier to ending NIMBYism? What are some tactics that we should employ to end NIMBYism in our community?
I think that's the most difficult question and an issue that we as a community are trying to address and grapple with. I think it's very important, first and foremost, to kind of unpack what NIMBYism is. Of someone who can identify, I think it's an ideology. I think it's a philosophy. It may not be this person who carries this NIMBYism ideology really is someone you can say that who doesn't believe in the philosophy of inclusion, which means he's excluding certain segments of the community, from its neighborhood. He's an exclusionist. He or she also carries this kind of preconceived notion about this person who we are calling an unhoused or homeless person. Now, we're just saying that this is a preconceived idea or preconceived notion that this person's carrying, the person who's carrying NIMBYism against the person who's homeless. It's very important for, how I always say that, if you're in the social service work, you know how to identify, there are indicators that could tell you that if this person has a low social emotional stability, this person is going to be on the verge of committing suicide. There are indicators. In the similar fashion, someone who identifies with NIMBYism indicators, there are certain things that person's going to do that will tell you that he carries that philosophy. Because it's also one important thing to acknowledge that someone who carries the NIMBYism ideology is also someone who carries like this deep-rooted power or the authority to make the choice that I don't want this person in my backyard. I mean, just pause and think what power this person has, or this segment of the community has, to be able to make that decision that this segment of the community should not be in my backyard. There is some power. So it's very important that when we talk about NIMBYism, to unpack this and not just discuss in isolation, but just like for the homeless people, we identify the issue of homelessness with actual people who are homeless. In the similar fashion, I feel like when you want to address NIMBYism, it's very important to identify who's carrying that kind of a mindset. Who are those people? Where are they sitting? Are they sitting in our churches? Are they attending our congregations on Sundays and Fridays and Saturdays, in our synagogues, in our mosques? So then if that's the case, and if they're part of our network in our churches and in our congregations, then probably we need to address, NIMBYism as part of a sermon. We want to address this if someone claims to be religious, some can be, carrying this kind of an NIMBYism ideology. So I think one of the things that we should be doing is to be addressing this, in a very candid, open kind of forum, with our congregants, in our sermons, on the days when we address them. That's kind of one of very simple way to do it. But the other part, which I feel, people can discard this idea, but just the fact that for every, when we think about a homeless person, we look at one person at a time. Laura and, Rabbi Adam has this beautiful model that they're talking about, one person at a time. There's a significant amount of institutional work that people are doing in the nonprofit level. The city is doing some work, the congregations, the faith community is doing some work to address the issue of homelessness. I question that in order to address NIMBYism, who's addressing that issue? Who's owning that piece and saying that I am taking upon myself to address this NIMBYism? So what I think what I'm suggesting is that just the way we talk about addressing homelessness in an institutional fashion, like there are so many institutions involved, similarly to addressing NIMBYism, I think you need an institutional intervention. I think there has to be a collective, concerted effort to address that, because as I was mentioning earlier, that if you want to unpack NIMBYism, it's a racist ideology, it's a supremacist ideology. There's power game that we're playing. If I'm refusing someone in my backyard, there are these kind of issues that we're dealing with, and you cannot address that without having a concerted effort to address that. So I consider NIMBYism as a disease in the community, and just as homelessness is an issue that we're trying to address, I think we should address NIMBYism as an issue, and that we should have a very strategic and collective effort to address that. And that would require, some kind of thinking and strategy planning. But there's a way for us to address, because in that you're really trying to talk about the otherness. You're trying to address the issue of the otherness, that I treat this other person different than me, and I feel like I have the power to refuse this person to be in my backyard. So I guess I don't know if there's any follow-up that you have, but then those are my thoughts.
I think that leads us really well into the next question, which is, Larry, about 55 to 65% of individuals who are in the Dallas and Collin County homeless rehousing system is Black. And they're Black men, which is, and as we're talking about NIMBYism, and as we're talking about landlords not wanting certain people in their neighborhoods, we're really talking to Almas's point about white supremacy. We're talking about racism and race, right? So why is it important for faith communities to acknowledge racial equity? Why is that an important tenet? And then Rabbi Adam, I'd also like kind of your perspective on that question as well. You're on mute, Larry.
And that sends me tacking back toward David's introduction. You have nailed one of our, ugly secrets, if you will, as a community, and that is the disproportionate share of African-American men who are homeless. And the whole matter of racial equity, inclusive strategies for leadership in the private sector as well as the public, that brings everyone together and welcomes everyone. Everyone is a vision that we need to all pursue, I think. One approach we have taken about NIMBYism is to take a look at property values around projects once the projects are completed. And there's some great research out of the NYU, their School of Real Estate, that demonstrate that permanent supportive housing actually contributes to the increase in value of property surrounding these developments. But the whole racism, white supremacy piece is pervasive and in some ways overwhelming. It should be attacked and dismantled by people like are on this Zoom event. It's despicable, and the current move to suppress voting is something we should all pay attention to every single moment. Our democracy is in danger, and we need to enable every qualifier, every eligible voter to get to the polls, including people who are homeless. And we're trying to register our neighbors as quickly as we can, but that is a huge problem. Nissy, it's just and it's not going to go away by us acting like it doesn't exist. And furthermore, I made a personal vow. I'm not going to speak anymore to African American folk or Hispanic folk about white racism. I'm going to speak about that to white people. We're working on a strategy that actually will bring staff aboard to talk about racism and racial equity to people who look like me. Now, I need to support people who are of color and love them, and that's an easy thing to do. But I need to take care of the people that are like me, who are not facing the facts about how the country is not moving in the right direction.
Thank you, Larry. That's great. I'd love to get Rabbi Adam, your perspective on that. How do you tackle that in your congregation?
So as I mentioned, part of the impetus for us was to close the gap between ourselves and between the communities that lie beyond these imaginary or real, and as the case may be, borders of our neighborhoods. So when we started the Ladder Project, we had all the intentions in the world to ensure, based on the reality of the demographics of the homeless population, that we would hopefully identify somebody who is representative of the realness of that problem and all of the racial, socioeconomic complexities that go into it. The first individual that we found at the bridge was somebody who was African American. And because immediately after we started that journey with them, there was a problem with their drug test, we had to pivot to the next person that the bridge had identified, who happened to be white. As we were getting this project off the ground, it was really important for us to build momentum, to keep going. And we're glad, we feel blessed that we found the connection with the first individual that we built the program around, but have been committed ever since to ensuring that that the folks that we take in for the project are reflective of the demographics of the homeless population in Dallas. And that's why since then, the few women that we have helped have been African American. I will say also, it is really important in a community like ours, where that is not very racially diverse, though the Jewish community is becoming increasingly racially diverse, that we push our folks. I think part of what it means to be a member of a community, to be a member of a tribe, is to look out for ourselves first. And I think in a lot of ways, in many cases, there's nothing wrong with that. Part of the reason that we're still around after thousands and thousands of years is because we do care a lot about our own community, care a lot about the next generation of the Jewish people. But the sources, the Bible, the Talmud, the Mishnah, all the Jewish legal sources are very, very clear that our responsibility is not just to our own community, but rather to those beyond our doors. And that therefore the time, the money that we invest in the world has to be a reflection of the diversity of that world. And so I think we've made great strides with that within our own community, and certainly the work that we've done with the Ladder Project is helping us in that regard. And I want to make sure Laura also has a chance to weigh on this as well.
One quick follow-up, just to be clear, we don't, as a project, require drug testing. However, when we first started the program, and we went to one of our congregants and said, we want you to take someone who lives in the bridge and let them live in your apartment complex. And that was a new concept for them, and they were very open to it. And we said, we don't want, they don't have credit, don't have a credit history. They can't pay a security deposit, but you'll get your rent every month and we'll guarantee the rent. And that individual said, that's fine, but is there a drug or alcohol problem? I don't allow that. And I said, well, he's been clean for 6 months. He's great. We're ready to go. And he said, well, just do me a favor, just have him do a quick drug test for me, and that'll just make me feel better. So I said, no problem. There will be no problem with this gentleman passing the drug test. So I went to the bridge, I picked him up, and I said, we're moving you to your new apartment. Everybody's waiting for you. We're so excited, and we're just going to go by the lab. The landlord would like you to get a drug test, and I know you've been clean for 6 months, so this is not a problem. And his eyes got really big, and he said, I can't do it. I was smoking pot this morning in the bridge parking lot. And I said, oh God. So anyway, so we went to the next person at the bridge that they were recommending that we help. But as the rabbi said, nearly 70% of the homeless in Dallas are Black. And so we have said ever since our first participant, we now go to the organizations when we say, is there someone that you have that would be a good candidate for us? We say we would like a Black family. We just think that's important. And I think everyone needs to have that. If that's the demographic, then that's what the community should be focused on. And that's our opinion.
Thank you, Rabbi Adam and Laura. Pastor Chris, I'd love to get your opinion. You lead one of the foremost Black churches in Dallas, and how does a Black community get engaged and work around homelessness? How do the Black faith leaders across the city and the county help us end homelessness?
Yeah, I think it's very challenging. And to be honest, I don't think they have the answers, just like the Anglo community is struggling. I think the reality is the African-American pastors are struggling as well. Although a lot of the homeless are family members of those within our congregation. It is not an easy answer across the board. There is no one answer because people are homeless for a diverse amount of reasons. I think that you have to have a diverse amount of approaches to address this particular issue. But unfortunately, I think in the African-American community, we're struggling, to be honest, much like the Anglo community is really struggling about how do we address this particular issue.
Thank you for your honesty. Larry, were you going to say something earlier? I wanted to make sure I got you in. Oh, you're on mute.
I think I was just trying to get on mute. That's what I
Oh.
I didn't have anything to add.
Okay.
Trying to figure out the technology.
Okay. Well, David, I'd love to pull in some questions from the audience. Will you share your top few?
Yes, let's see what we got here. This is a really good question, actually. This is, and if you would like, if you put a question in the chat, don't do that. Go ahead and copy it into the Q&A, because that's kind of where it best belongs, and we'll try to answer a select number of them. This is a great question. This is from Dr. Valerie Hawthorne, who is the Director of Government Relations at the North Texas Food Bank, and here's what she asks. Kind of a contrarian kind of question. I like it. You have all seen a lot of good ideas, so I ask, though it may appear to have good intentions, what is the worst approach to homelessness solutions? Who wants to take that?
Larry?
Well, I'll be crazy enough to try. The worst approach is to do nothing and to assume that things are going to get better, or that we understand why things are the way they are. And so just to walk past another human being is to risk irreparable damage to one's own psyche and soul, in my view. And to say nothing of what it does to the person who may be approaching you. Having said that, I'm not an advocate for just throwing money, behind the king. But somehow there's magic in what the Rabbi and Laura have shared. And it's rooted in this personal connection that's part of the psyche and the power of faith. And if we try to get the scale because the problem is so enormous. But if we surrender our humanity and the intimacy of oppression, as crazy as that sounds, we will be losing big time and we'll never get to the solution. So we can't just do nothing.
I'd like to add, I think the worst scenario would be that we would treat the issue of homelessness without incorporating, connecting, tying it back to race and equity issue. I think we do disservice if we're only addressing the issue of homelessness without addressing the other end of the spectrum, which is the affordable housing and permanent housing. It's incomplete. I just feel like, that may not be the ideal scenario. And the third disservice, or, not a very constructive approach would be to address the issue of homelessness, which is short-term, which doesn't have a sustainable life to it, where, we talked about, this idea of self-reliance and, being able to, this person should be able to sustain his or her life independently and not seeking out for that intervention day in and day out from an institution. So, I think every time we talk about homelessness, it's very important to talk about affordable housing, together. And I think that those are key things that we have to keep in mind. Otherwise, it may be a very limited vision in which we may be addressing this issue.
All right, let's take a look at the next question we have here.
I'd love to do Dr. Woody's comment, David.
Yes. Great minds think alike, Nissy. That's where I was going. So Dr. Woody asks this question. It has been affirming to hear Rabbi Roffman and Mayor Miller tell the community about the Ladder Project, the collaboration with the bridge and the roller coaster ride, which is supporting a guest establish a safety net in the community which they can own. How can my organization's leadership connect with church leadership of various faiths across our community about transitioning a guest to stability they can own with the supportive relationships, connections, and treasure a church community might possess?
And of course, Dr. Woody is the CEO of the Bridge.
Yes,
we have talked a lot about.
Sorry. Yes.
So I mean, obviously, this conversation is a great first step to answering that question, which is to say, I know Larry made reference to this earlier, that it's been, especially over this past year, where we've been so overwhelmed with this alternate universe that we've been living in, to prioritize our connection and our responsibility to each other and to share knowledge, best practices, to share our values and our faith. But part of the reason that we went on this journey was because we believed in it, and we believed that it was possible and doable, not just for our congregation, but for any congregation. And I know that Laura and her committee have worked really, really hard on writing all this stuff down, on creating a record of what it is that we have been through over the last few years and the challenges we faced and the successes that we've had, because we knew that it would be useful and it would be helpful to others who wanted to try and do the same thing. We're ready for the story to be told, and we're hoping that, well, I know that we're hoping that this conversation and others will enable that to happen.
Thank you, Dr. Woody, because you were the one who told me when we came down, isolation is what you need to think about. And we've always remembered that you told us that. And we thank you for helping us to start the program by giving us the opportunity to come into the bridge and to talk to your caseworkers and find somebody. But I think, when we think broader about this, the congregations can do it. The schools could do it. Companies could do it. Okay. You take a big company and you say, we're going to do this. And you create the committee, companies like Southwest Airlines that do all kinds of house building and all that. This can just be another component. And it's the hardest thing is, when do you stop helping? We have not had the experience of, we are your safety net. We've taught you everything we know. We've given you all the resources of 1,000 congregants. But hey, how come you're not ready to fly? It's a challenge. And so the biggest challenge to this whole idea is, when do you stop being the safety net?
Yeah. I think sometimes the church feels like the problem is just simply insurmountable. And I think the church needs to be educated about the variety of resources that are out there to really help homeless individuals. And really, education is really critical and important. We have been able to collaborate with so many organizations that has helped us as we've come across homeless individuals to get them into help, to get them on a track where they can get the help that they need. And so I think as the bridge looks forward to working with churches, it is really educating them that you're not asking them to do everything, that you're asking them to bring their resources, compassion, concern to the table, and letting them know that there are other resources that they can collaborate to really help individuals move on a path of not being homeless.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Pastor Chris. Any other questions, David?
Let's see. And I wanted to reiterate what Pastor Chris is saying. Pastor Chris reminds me of a saying from, I think it was Bishop Desmond Tutu, who was asked, you've got this huge change you had to make. I mean, we're just talking about homelessness in Dallas and Collin County. I mean, that was, how do you turn around an entire country from apartheid? And he said that it's like asking the question of how do you eat an elephant? And the answer is one bite at a time. And so I think that's kind of what Pastor Chris is saying, and that's, I think, what reflecting what the Ladder Project is all about, right? The Ladder Project was not Laura and the rabbis at Shearith saying, okay, we need to solve all of homelessness. The question was, no, how do we end the homelessness of one person? And then, if each one of the churches and synagogues and mosques does the same thing, then, it's one bite at a time. So let's see here. I like this, again, I like these kind of contrarian questions a little bit. So Evan asks, people have different reasons for saying, not in my backyard. What would you say to a South Dallas property owner who said, please, not in my backyard again?
In some conversations with Larry, one of the things that he really is a proponent of is the importance of mixed income situations, not putting all the homeless individuals in one neighborhood, that there is benefits of really diversifying the homeless population across the city so that they are not really corralled in one community that is already struggling with resources. And so I think that response is, we are really stretched with resources. And if we can begin to diversify some of these issues, it would be so much better. Kind of like when all of Dallas became wet. I mean, South Dallas was inundated with so many liquor stores. Now that, everybody can have a liquor store, it has made it so much that the concentration is not in one particular community, that this challenge is now everyone's challenge, that everybody is able to address.
Yeah, it's a matter of proportion and policy. Some solutions to not in my backyard, or to alleviate that fear, is to put it somewhere else by policy, where you wake up and all of the issues and all the locations and all the development is in one part of the city, without providing the support necessary to make even that halfway work. But I think we're talking about two different things here.
Well, I also think that one thing that would help in Dallas a lot, we have never seen so much growth as we've seen in the last 5 years with apartments. I mean, they're everywhere, thousands and thousands of them, and that's not going to stop anytime soon. The population trends show that. And City Hall has talked a long time about workforce housing and offsets for developers in order to build and get to build high and get to do all the things that they want, that they've got to provide units that are affordable. And it really isn't happening to the scale that would help Larry and Cornerstone and Faith Forward to really see some movement in getting people into affordable housing. You know, we've lived, our gentleman has lived in a studio apartment very comfortably for 3 years, and there are not enough of those in our city for other people to live in. And he has not been a problem at all for 3 years. And most people who got into those apartments will not be a problem. They just need the place to live.
You know, we were constructing 511 North Ackerd when you were Mayor Miller, and we opened that building with over 200 apartments in 2010. And we have a significant number of residents who've been there the entire time. And it's home, there's stability there. It's insane. It's an insane process trying to make that old building work sometimes. And we have issues there, but the people have really stabilized. And, you know, so far as I can tell, there's almost no set-asides for the development of these kinds of properties. And I've sit on a couple of TIF boards, and I was the drone. Every meeting I would raise the issue of affordable housing, but there aren't the set-asides. And at one level, it's difficult because inclusionary zoning is against the law in the state of Texas. You can't mandate inclusion in this state.
Do you guys recall the recent, article that came out in Texas Tribune about Dallas and Plano listed as the most expensive, for people with low, wages, very limited wages are, it's the most difficult, most expensive cities, to live in, and Dallas and Plano were on that list. So as I mentioned, that, to your point, Larry, that in order for us to talk about homelessness, we also have to talk about affordable housing, but also mixed housing, right? You don't want everybody to be clustered. So to the question that was asked, the whole response that, Pastor Chris gave is because pretty much everybody wants to now just go in South Dallas, to do all kind of development work. And if that's the case, then, you're creating like a cluster of one kind of people, in that community. So mixed income and, having them being part of the mainstream community is what we're really talking about. And that's when we are addressing and allowing that community to provide that nurture. One apartment, one corporation, one organization, one faith community, and with one, homeless person. And that kind of network is what is needed. It's the location, who decides, where a new construction is going to come, who's making that decision. So that's a very important conversation as well, and important consideration.
Well, thank you so much for this incredible conversation. Since we are at time, I'm going to allow David to provide our conclusion at the end. I really want to thank Pastor Chris, Larry, Almas, Laura, and Rabbi Roffman for this wonderful conversation. For those of you who joined us, we are thankful that you are part of this conversation. We want you to connect your personal journey to faith and to ending homelessness. We want you to come on the journey of ending NIMBYism. We want you to come on the journey of mixed income apartments and affordable housing. We want you to get your congregations to partner with us, with the Homeless Rehousing System, with MDHA, and all the different entities that came here. There's lots of work that's being done. There's lots of resources in the community. Come join us. So I'll hand it off to David.
Wow. Yeah, I underline that message. So back kind of connecting it to what we started with. So my ancestors throughout the last 1,951 years have asked, what do we need to do to restore the glory of our people since the temple was destroyed 1,951 years ago? And the late chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook, said that since the temple was destroyed due to their mistreatment of each other, it would only be rebuilt if they would fix that. And this is the message of today's discussion, as well as the message of this entire series. The God of my tradition, again, doesn't really care how you treat him or her. He really cares how you treat others. He doesn't care at all how beautiful your house of worship is. He just cares that everyone have a house. It's just that simple. Because when you see a person experiencing homelessness, God sees something else. And here's what he does. This may be the most profound statement ever uttered regarding every person's inherent worth. And this comes from my tradition. Rabbi Joshua ben Levi said, a procession of angels passes before each person, and the heralds go before them, saying, make way for the image of God. Make way for the image of God. Thank you all for attending today. Have a wonderful weekend.